We've all seen the military ads at the movie theaters, on during hockey games. It's starting to reach sort of that American level of in-your-face advertising by the military. And it's very related to the whole struggle we have, I think, to build a movement against the war in Afghanistan, for the war resistors' right to stay here in Canada, is sort of taking on this whole militarism. Just to give one small example, the recent Grey Cup final is Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, right? But the game was in Toronto. And it was very, very striking. Of course, we're all used to the Super Bowl. If any of us watch the Super Bowl, it's all used to that with the F-16s flying overhead and very flag-waving militaristic affair. This year's Grey Cup was really the first time I've ever seen this. The actual presentation of the trophy was made by the Defense Minister, Peter MacKay. So not only did they have the Army out there at halftime before the game and after the game, so our Defense Minister actually presented the trophy rather than the CFL commissioner doing it themselves. So it would be like Donald Rumsfeld before he was turfed out of there, handing over the Super Bowl trophy or the NBA trophy. It was very, very disturbing, and this is just one small example of how the military recruiting and general militarization of our society is much more in our face. So we're really happy today to have a longtime activist on counter-recruitment issues, David Solnit. He was involved in the Seattle protests. Some of you might have heard a few years back there were some protests in Seattle. David was a key organizer in bringing some of the direct action organizing that happened in Seattle in 1999. More recently, in 2003, David was involved with organizing that helped to shut down the business district of San Francisco the day that the war in Iraq started. Right now, actually, he's involved with Direct Action. I don't know if the group has a name yet.
Direct Action to Stop the War again.
Direct Action to Stop the War, San Francisco or Bay Area.
So thank you. It's always very dangerous when you ask Americans for suggestions. You never know what part of the world you might end up in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Amy, my co-author, is a Gulf War I era veteran. She joined Amy Allison, who co-wrote this with me. She went to high school in Oakland, where I live, and wanted to go to college. Big family, low income. Only way to get into college, she thought, was join the military. And there was a recruiter on campus every day of the year. She thought he was part of the campus. So when her parents couldn't send her to college, she said, hey, I've got a problem. He said, I've got a solution. She signed up for the military. 5 years later, they said, you're going to Iraq for Gulf War I, and she said, no, I'm not. And after a prolonged struggle, she actually got out, very rare circumstance, as a conscientious objector. And in retrospect, she's went into business, and she did some analysis. She said she actually would have made much more money for college than she ever saw from the government had she taken a job at McDonald's. So she and I have been traveling around the United States supporting counter-recruitment efforts because we believe it's both the most effective way to stop the war, and not just the war in Iraq, because it didn't start in Iraq and it's not going to end with Bush, but to try and long-term reverse U.S. foreign policy. So the United States has 2.5 million soldiers, including reserves. We have 6,000 bases in the United States and its so-called territories, like Puerto Rico. And we have 700 foreign bases in 130 other people's countries. So when you have that kind of a military, you're an empire.
Did you say 6,000?
6,000 facilities in the U.S. and its territories. And the United States faces the problem governments always have, is how the hell do you get people to fight wars when they're not natural and people don't want to fight them? They'd rather be doing something else, right? And how do you get the public to support them? So that was what we kind of poked around and tried to figure out in this book, Army of Done. How do they get 2.5 million people to fight the United States wars? It's amazing. And when we looked at it, we found out, it's not just a simple thing. They don't just hire recruiters and say, hey, recruiter, can you go out and recruit some young people? They've actually developed what we call the military recruitment complex. There's a huge complex of institutions, starting with research institutions that study what makes some people join and not other people, makes recommendations to the next set of institutions, which are public relations institutions, the biggest PR firms in the world are working for the U.S. military. And then that gets passed on to the 9,000 recruiters who have altogether they have a $4 billion budget. 9,000 recruiters, $4 billion budget. And then finally, they've commandeered a lot of our public institutions. So the largest database in the world of people is the youth of America. And when Bush passed a fake education policy called No Child Left Behind, part of it said that the name of every young person, all their details, has to get turned over to the military. So the military has information about all of America's youth. And the good news is the United States military is in crisis. They're not able to recruit as many people as they want, and that's good. So there's been a pattern when be all you can be wasn't working anymore. They fired the public relations and they hired the Burnett PR company. And this will be an American advertising culture test, but the Joe Burnett Advertising Company is a historic PR firm that came up with the Marlboro Man, Tony the Tiger, and the Pillsbury Doughboy. So then they went to work and came up with Army of One that we ripped off for our title. So a few years back, they were not meeting quota in 2005. They're significantly below. They were doing everything they could. They couldn't figure it out, so they fired the PR, hired McCain Erickson, gave him a big chunk of that $4 billion, and they came up with, there's strong, and then there's Army Strong. And that's the new campaign, Army Strong, kind of like Ford Tough. And this is actually a shot where they rolled it out in Washington and sort of with a big hoopla showed all the politicians and military brass their new Army Strong campaign. And there's all kinds of folks. So McCain Erickson is the lead one, but if the folks who do the TV videos are the same people that did Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Green Day, I think even the Rolling Stones. So they're utilizing popular culture as much as possible and cutting edge popular culture. This is America's Army. Has anyone here ever played it? So if there's anyone who hasn't played computer games, it's a multiplayer, so people from anywhere are all on playing the same time, and it's a shooting game. So you have targets come up and you shoot at them, and there's multiple players, and you can also text. And so this is a downloadable game, so you can go to the Army's website, you can download it, and then you can play it hooked into the internet with other players. And at any point you can either talk to a recruiter, or apparently they'll talk to you if you do well. And they just started to release these as coin-operated games in video arcades. And when they sent out the press release for this, they're so blatant. They said, our goal is to penetrate youth culture. And how old do you think this kid is? 6, something like that. This is a climbing wall at a community event in Southern California. But we like to say that recruiting is actually cradle to grave, and that they are trying to penetrate youth culture. They want this kid to think about the military, to normalize it, to instill it and embed it. Yo soy el Army, I am the Army. And Hernan Suarez Diaz, who's a recently returned Iraq war vet, he was Venezuelan born, grew up in Miami, joined the U.S. military, and he still hasn't received his citizenship. So he actually couldn't be here with me, because even though he did like a 14-month tour of duty in Iraq, they haven't managed to get him any U.S. citizenship paper. So Hanan, who I've been traveling around the Northwest with and couldn't come up here, he's a Navy corpsman, which means he does medical stuff. He basically works with a unit of Marines, and he patches them together and takes care of them medically. So he knows everything about Marines, and the Marines are called devil dogs. That's sort of their nickname. And so apparently a common term on Marine bases, when I showed him this slide, he said, devil pups. That's what they call them. And this is a Marine-run program called Young Marines. It starts at age 8, takes place often through U.S. public schools and private schools. And, you know, it's sort of like Boy Scouts, but not, in that they go and bivouac, have military discipline, that type of stuff. When we show it to people, they often will say, well, what country is that? This is the more popular military youth program, ROTC. And there's junior ROTC for younger folks in high schools, and then ROTC, which usually takes place on college campuses. This is in Kentucky. These young women are doing rifle practice or drill practice during one of their periods in the hallway outside the gymnasium inside their school. So where I live in Oakland, we have it's a very rough place to grow up as a kid. We have 100, 150 kids who get shot in the street in gun violence every year. So you show up at a school with a knife or a gun, you're out of there for good. And so at the same time, in a lot of these schools, they're training people how to use arms. Basically, there's a process of trying to break people down and get us to unlearn the things that we've learned in our community, from our family, our parents, our church, and then remake people into folks who can follow orders and kill if necessary. My first counter recruitment experience, my nephew was a feisty young man from Albuquerque who was, you know, big, feisty fellow, and so he's like, I'm going to be a Navy SEAL. And this was a bunch of years ago. I was a couple years older than him, and I had come and encountered a number of Vietnam veterans who gave me a heads up about the military. So I said, hey, I wrote him a letter and said, be aware about what you're getting into, be careful of this, this, and this, and think, you know, take a hard look at it. And he said I was one of the only adults who actually really seriously engaged him about that, and that's a huge thing. It's like, and that's the core counter recruiting, is one-on-one connection with young people. As Amy and I have traveled, and Amy in particular, connecting with young women who have joined, we've probably met 5 young women along our trips who, after having a sit-down, one-on-one conversation where she took a half hour and talked to them about their decision and kept in touch and followed up, they changed their minds. One young woman, instead of joining the Army, she hadn't been to boot camp yet, so it wasn't too late. She's decided to become a firefighter. And that's actually what my nephew did, Alex, is he became the country's youngest smoke jumper, those crazy people who jump out of helicopters with 90-pound packs and try and put out forest fires. He did that for 10 years, and now he just got his nursing degree. But if we set ourselves up to have stepping stones along the way, like limiting access to recruiters in school, or getting a certain number of families at a particular high school to opt out, or actually one person making a different decision in their lives that they're proud of, you know, that keeps me going. Lieutenant Aaron Watada was the first officer to publicly refuse, and was able to amplify a message that a lot of people heard about the illegality of the war. And one thing you'll note, I'm as a puppeteer, so as he was being court-martialed, we did a big arts organizing. I'm a big advocate of using art and culture, and if we're not having fun, we're probably not doing something right. So I try and figure out ways to make our organizing fun, and you should use your hands. I tell my busy organizer friends, if you do a certain amount of art or theater, it's economically efficient because it will cut down on your therapy bills in later years. But as Lieutenant Watada is being court-martialed inside, so we did a giant puppet pageant to put the war on trial. So this is the judge here, and these are all the violations of U.S. Constitution and international law, and the jury. And so people may know that Lieutenant Watada actually received a mistrial. They couldn't convict him. There were too many contradictions. And so they got a mistrial, and we actually got a conviction of the Bush administration. You know, this was great. For a day we shut down. You know, we created costs. It was a good message, just like the WTO. Very effective strategy for one day in one city. But if we really want to shut down the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, we have to be able to come up with a strategy where we do that not just for one day in one city, but do it for a longer period of time in every city.